Of course, here is the rewritten story, optimized for viral YouTube storytelling. You ever hear a sound that makes the hair on your arms stand up? Not a scream, not a gunshot. Something quieter. The sound of a man's soul being sold. That's the sound that hit the stranger the second he rode into Dust Creek. It was the middle of the day, sun beating down so hard it felt like a hammer on your skull. But the whole town was gathered in the main square, not for a festival, but for something much, much uglier. They were auctioning off a human being. On a rickety wooden crate stood a young woman. Her dress was ripped at the shoulder. Her face was smudged with the kind of dirt that comes from crying and trying to wipe the tears away with dusty hands. She couldn't have been more than 20, but it was her eyes. Man, it was her eyes. They weren't broken. They were burning, a wildfire in a world of ash. The stranger, Marcus, just sat on his horse, a tired-looking beast that had seen too many miles. He was just passing through. That was the plan anyway. Stay invisible. He'd gotten real good at being invisible over the last 3 years, but watching this, it felt like a fist was tightening around his heart. The auctioneer, a fat man with teeth the color of wet tobacco, yelled out, "Come on, gentlemen. Sarah here owes $300 on her daddy's gambling debt. A fine specimen, good for cooking, cleaning, whatever else you might need." A few of the rough-looking men in the crowd laughed, a greasy, ugly sound. Marcus saw one of them, a big fellow with a tangled beard, lick his lips as he stared at the girl. Marcus had seen that look 1,000 times. It was the look of a wolf sizing up a lamb. It never, ever ended well. The bidding was stalled at $250. The man with the beard had the high bid. The girl, Sarah, her eyes scanned the crowd, desperate, searching for a miracle, for an escape hatch that didn't exist. And that's when she saw him. Her eyes locked right onto Marcus. Time just stopped. He expected to see pleading, begging. But that's not what was in her eyes, no. She looked at him with a strange kind of intensity, like she was trying to memorize his face, like she knew something terrible was about to happen, and she wanted to remember the last halfway decent person she ever saw. It broke something inside him. He'd made a promise to himself. No trouble, no attention. He had business in these parts, the kind of business that could get a man killed if he made too much noise. Hidden beneath his worn coat was a leather pouch. Inside that pouch was enough gold to buy this whole sorry town and have enough left over for a steak dinner. But nobody here knew that. To them, he was just another drifter. Dust on his boots, holes in his shirt. That's how he wanted it. 275! The bearded man shouted, a greedy grin splitting his face. And that was it. Marcus couldn't stomach it. He couldn't ride away and let this happen. He nudged his horse forward, the crowd parting like water around a stone. His hand didn't go to his gun. It went to his coat. He spoke, his voice quiet, but it cut through the noise like a razor. $500. You could have heard a pin drop. The whole town went dead silent. The auctioneer's jaw hit his chest. The bearded man looked like he'd been slapped. Even the girl, Sarah, just stared at him, her defiant mask cracking to reveal pure, unfiltered shock. Did you say $500? The auctioneer stammered, his eyes wide. Marcus just nodded once. He never took his eyes off the girl. He saw the confusion warring with a tiny, fragile spark of hope. The bearded man spun around, his face turning a blotchy red. "Who in the hell are you, boy?" Marcus finally looked at him, his gaze as cold as a winter grave. "Someone who's got $500. But as he reached into his coat for the gold, he saw it. Out of the corner of his eye, 3 men standing near the back of the crowd. They weren't looking at the girl anymore. They weren't looking at the auctioneer. They were looking right at him. And they weren't just looking. They were exchanging glances. Quick, sharp, meaningful glances. They recognized something. Maybe it was his face. Maybe it was his horse. Maybe it was the way he said $500 like it was nothing. And in that instant, a cold dread washed over Marcus. He had just made the biggest mistake of his life. His past, the one he'd been running from for 3 long years, had just found him. And it found him at the worst possible moment. The sound of the gold coins hitting the auctioneer's dusty table was like a gunshot in the dead silent square. One by one, Marcus counted them out. Each clink of metal was an accusation. Every eye in Dust Creek was on him. In a town like this, $500 in gold wasn't just money. It was a statement. It was a mystery. It was a target. Sold, the auctioneer finally croaked, but his voice was shaky. He was already scared. He knew this was something more than just a transaction. Marcus swung down from his horse and walked toward the platform. The girl, Sarah, stepped down from the crate, her legs trembling so hard he was surprised she could stand. When he got close, he could see the raw fear she'd been hiding behind that fiery defiance. "What's your name?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Marcus," he said, and then turned to the crowd. "Show's over, folks." But it wasn't over. It was just getting started. The three men from the back were pushing their way forward. They moved with a purpose that made Marcus's stomach clench. He recognized the man in the lead, Jake Morrison, a bounty hunter with a reputation as mean as a rattlesnake and a memory to match. His face was all sharp angles and suspicion. "Well, I'll be damned," Jake drawled, his hand resting casually on the butt of his pistol. "Marcus Dalton, I thought you were dead." A murmur went through the crowd. The name Dalton meant something here. It was a name tied to money, power, and a whole lot of trouble. Not the kind of trouble Marcus wanted anything to do with right now. Sarah looked from Jake to Marcus, her eyes wide with confusion and a dawning sense of dread. "What's happening?" she mouthed. "Stay close to me," Marcus said, his voice low and urgent. "Don't say a word." Jake took another step closer, his two partners fanning out on either side of him, a classic predator's move. "Boys, we got ourselves a genuine puzzle here," Jake said, speaking to the crowd as much as to Marcus. "See, the story I heard was that Marcus Dalton is broke. His daddy, old William Dalton, he lost everything before he got himself killed. Left his boy with nothing but shame and a mountain of debt." The bearded man who'd lost the bid suddenly looked very interested. "Then where'd he get 500 in gold? That's the question of the hour, isn't it?" Jake's eyes narrowed, pinning Marcus in place. "Funny thing, there's been some talk lately. Talk about a whole heap of missing railroad money. And here's poor Marcus Dalton, supposed to be broke as a church mouse, throwing around gold coins like they're pebbles." Marcus felt Sarah go rigid beside him. She was smart. He could see it in her eyes. She was putting the pieces together, and she didn't like the picture they were making. This wasn't about her debt anymore. This was bigger, much bigger, and much more dangerous. "You've got me confused with someone else," Marcus said, his voice level. He was trying to project calm, but inside his heart was hammering against his ribs. "I'm just a drifter, happened to have some savings." Jake let out a short, sharp laugh that had no humor in it. "Savings? Son, I know for a fact you didn't have 2 cents to rub together a year ago. I know what you did to get that money. And I know there's a hell of a lot more where that came from." The crowd was closing in now. The air was thick with greed and the promise of violence. They could smell it, the smell of a payday. And that's when Sarah did something he never would have expected. She stepped forward, positioning herself just slightly between Marcus and the bounty hunter. Her voice when she spoke was shockingly strong. "This man just bought my freedom, fair and square. If you have business with him, you can take it up somewhere else." Jake's eyes flickered to her, his expression turning cold. "Lady, you have no idea what you just stepped into." "I know I just stepped away from being sold to that animal over there," she shot back, nodding toward the fuming bearded man. "And I know I'm standing with the man who stopped it. For now, that's enough for me." Marcus just stared at her. This girl who seconds ago was property was now standing up to three armed men for a total stranger. It was either the bravest damn thing he'd ever seen or the most foolish. He couldn't decide which, but Jake wasn't the type to be moved by bravery. "Here's how this is going to go," he said, his eyes locking back onto Marcus. "You're coming with us, Dalton, and we're going to have a nice long chat about where you've been, what you've been doing, and where you hid the rest of the railroad's money." Marcus's hand twitched, moving instinctively toward his own gun, but he stopped. Too many people. Too much chaos. If leads started flying, Sarah was standing right in the crossfire, He couldn't risk that. I need some time, Marcus said, his mind racing, to get my affairs in order. A slow, predatory grin spread across Jake's face. You got 1 hour, he said. Then we come looking for you. And trust me, we'll find you. As the crowd slowly started to break apart, the reality of the situation crashed down on Marcus. His one simple act of decency hadn't just saved a girl. It had painted a giant, glowing target on both of their backs. And Sarah, the girl he'd just saved, still had no idea that she was now tied to the most wanted man in 3 states. Marcus led her to the edge of town, to the spot where he'd left his horse. His mind was a whirlwind, cycling through a dozen different plans, and every single one of them ended in blood. The sun was getting higher, hotter. Each tick of the clock was a step closer to Jake Morrison and his men kicking down whatever door they were behind. You need to leave, Marcus said, his voice flat. He didn't look at her. He was busy checking his saddlebags, making sure everything was secure. Take this. He shoved a wad of bills into her hand. $50. More than enough to get a ticket on the next stagecoach heading anywhere but here. Get on it. Don't look back. Don't tell anyone you ever saw me. Sarah looked down at the money, then back up at him, her brow furrowed in confusion. You just spent $500 on me. Now you're giving me 50 more just to go away? That doesn't make any sense. Nothing about this makes sense, Marcus muttered, his hands moving deeper into his saddlebags. There it was, wrapped in oilcloth, a heavy rectangular package. Enough stolen railroad money to get him hanged 10 times over. He hadn't been running with it. He'd been trying to figure out how to give it back without ending up at the end of a rope. What did you steal? Her voice was quiet, but it cut right through his frantic thoughts. Marcus froze. He slowly turned to look at her. What makes you think I stole anything? Because, she said, taking a step closer, innocent men don't look the way you looked when that bounty hunter said your name. They don't carry that much gold when they're dressed in rags. And, she paused, her eyes searching his, they don't save a random girl at an auction unless they know exactly what it feels like to be desperate. He just stared at her. There was a sharpness to her, a keen intelligence that he had completely missed on that auction block. This wasn't just some damsel in distress. You're too smart for your own good, he finally said. Smart enough to know you're in real trouble, she countered, and smart enough to know that if you ride out of here and leave me behind, Jake Morrison is going to grab me the second you're gone. He'll use me to get to you. Damn it, she was right, and they both knew it. She was leveraged now. The bounty hunter wouldn't think twice. His simple act of kindness had become a chain, binding them together. He let out a long, weary breath. The secret he'd guarded with his life for 3 years was about to come out. The money belongs to the Central Pacific Railroad, he said, the words feeling strange in his mouth. I didn't exactly steal it, but I didn't earn it either. Her eyes widened slightly. What does that mean? Marcus looked past her, toward the jagged peaks of the mountains in the distance. He had another stash hidden up there, the main evidence. My father worked for the railroad, head of accounting. He found out some of the top men were skimming. Phantom payrolls, selling off company supplies and pocketing the cash, keeping 2 sets of books. It was a massive conspiracy. And when he tried to report them, she said, her voice a whisper, they had him killed, Marcus finished, made it look like a robbery gone wrong. So you took their money, she said, understanding dawning on her face. I took the evidence, he corrected her. The money was part of it. A ledger, a paper trail. I've been on the run ever since, trying to figure out how to get it to someone who wouldn't just take the money and bury the story. Someone honest. She hesitated for a second, as if afraid to ask the next question. How much money are we talking about? Marcus looked back at her, his expression grim. Enough to buy this town, and the next one, and the one after that. Before she could even process that, a new sound cut through the air. The thunder of hoofbeats, a lot of them, coming hard and fast. They both spun around. It was Jake Morrison, and he hadn't come alone. He had 6 men with him now, all armed, all riding like they were headed to war. They're not waiting an hour, Sarah said, stating the obvious. Marcus didn't waste a second. He grabbed her arm. Can you ride? Well enough. Good. We're leaving. Now. He hoisted her onto his horse, swinging up into the saddle in front of her. But just as he was about to spur the animal into a gallop, Jake's voice boomed across the dusty plain. Marcus Dalton, it's over. We know about the railroad money. Marcus dug his heels in, the horse leaping forward. But Jake wasn't done. We know about your hideout in Devil's Canyon. The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. Devil's Canyon. That's where the rest of the evidence was. The ledgers. The proof. If they knew about that, then this was worse than he thought. Someone had been watching him. For weeks, maybe longer. Someone had followed him. But Jake's final shout was the one that turned his blood to ice. We also know about your father's journal. The one with all the names. Sarah felt Marcus go completely rigid in front of her. What journal? She whispered, her arms tightening around his waist. Marcus wasn't listening. He was staring at the approaching riders, a look of pure, unadulterated horror on his face, because he had just realized a terrible, terrible truth. They don't just want the money, he said, his voice a choked whisper. They want to bury the truth, and everyone who knows it. The canyon was a blur of red rock and desperate speed. Marcus pushed his horse harder than he ever had before, the animal's lungs burning, its hooves striking sparks on the stone trail. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit were a constant, terrifying drumbeat. Jake Morrison and his posse were closing in. Where are we going? Sarah shouted, her voice nearly lost in the wind. Somewhere they can't follow on horseback, Marcus yelled back. He veered off the main trail, forcing his mount up a treacherous, narrow slope of loose rock and scree. It was a climb that would kill a lesser horse, but his was sure-footed, bred for the mountains. As they scrambled higher, Sarah risked a glance back. What she saw stole the breath from her lungs. It wasn't just Jake's 6 men anymore. Below them, the trail was filling up with riders. A dozen, maybe more. It looked like a small army was converging on their position, pouring in from Dusk Creek, from side canyons, from every direction. Word had spread. The promise of railroad gold was a powerful lure. They finally reached a narrow, windswept ledge. Marcus brought the heaving horse to a stop. From here, they could see the whole valley laid out beneath them. Sweet Jesus, Sarah whispered. The sight was terrifying. Every bounty hunter, every gunslick, every desperate man within 50 miles was coming for them. You said your father had a journal, she said, her voice tight with fear. What was in it? Marcus reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a worn, leather-bound book. He handled it like it was a sacred relic. Everything, he said, his voice low. Names, dates, every crooked deal, every phantom shipment, every witness who was silenced. 3 years of my father's life is in this book. It's his testimony. He handed it to her. Sarah opened it, her fingers tracing the neat, precise handwriting. She scanned the pages, her eyes growing wider with every line she read. Marcus, she breathed, her face pale. These names. Some of these are territorial government officials, judges, even sheriffs. Now you understand, he said grimly. This isn't just about a few corrupt railroad barons. This is a rot that goes all the way to the top. They can't let this book survive. They can't let us survive. Sarah looked up at him, a sudden, terrible realization dawning on her face. The stolen money? It was never the real prize, was it? It was bait. He nodded, a muscle twitching in his jaw. My father was a clever man. He knew they'd hunt down anyone who had their stolen cash. He wanted to use me to draw them all out into the open. He wanted them to reveal themselves. A bitter, pained look crossed his face. I just don't think he planned on it taking 3 years. And I know he never, ever would have wanted an innocent woman dragged into the middle of it. Crack! A rifle shot echoed through the canyon. A bullet whined past Marcus's head, chipping a chunk of rock from the cliff face just inches away. They were in range. We have to move, Marcus said, his eyes darting around, searching for an escape. But there was none. The path ahead was blocked by a massive rockfall. Behind them was a sheer 40-foot drop onto a bed of jagged stones. They were trapped, boxed in. Marcus, look at this, Sarah said suddenly, her voice urgent. She was still staring at the journal. This entry, from 2 weeks before your father died. She held the book out to him. He took it, his eyes scanning the page she indicated, and his face went completely white. According to the entry, his father had a secret meeting, a clandestine meeting with someone from inside the railroad company, someone who had promised to help him, an informant. That's impossible, Marcus whispered. The whole company wanted him dead. Not the whole company, Sarah said, pointing a trembling finger at the name his father had written. Look at the name. Marcus read it again and again. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The meeting had been with a railroad security investigator, a man named James Morrison, Jake Morrison's older brother. Jake, Marcus breathed, the pieces clicking into place with sickening clarity. He's been hunting me for the very same people who killed his own brother. Sarah stared at him, her eyes wide with the horror of it. He doesn't know. He thinks you're the enemy. Another rifle shot, this one closer. It ricocheted off the rock near Sarah's feet, sending stone fragments flying. Jake's voice boomed up from below, distorted by the canyon walls. Dalton, it's over. Send down the journal, and we'll let the woman live. A lie. They'd kill them both the second they had the book. Marcus looked at Sarah. He looked at the journal in his hands. He looked at the army of killers climbing up the slope towards them. It was hopeless. There's something else, Sarah said, her voice barely a whisper. She had taken the journal back and was reading again, her eyes flying across the page. Your father didn't just document the corruption. He found out where they were keeping the rest of the stolen money, the main stash. Marcus stared at her. Where? Not in a vault in some big city, she said, looking up at him, her expression a mixture of shock and disbelief. It's in Dusk Creek, hidden right under everyone's noses. The irony was so thick, it was suffocating. The entire fortune, the proof that could bring the whole conspiracy crashing down, was sitting back in the miserable little town where this whole nightmare began. But that information was useless now. More bullets began to pepper the rocks around them, forcing them to duck down. Jake's men were getting closer, climbing with ropes now, scaling the cliff face. They were out of time. There was nowhere left to run. Sarah, Marcus said, his voice quiet and heavy, whatever happens next, I need you to know. Buying your freedom, it was the first decent thing I've done in 3 years. She looked at him, and for the first time, he saw not fear, but a fierce, burning resolve in her eyes. She pulled the spare pistol from his saddlebag, checking the cylinder. Then let's make damn sure it wasn't the last. The standoff on that ledge couldn't have lasted more than 30 seconds before the entire world exploded into chaos. It wasn't a bullet that changed everything. It was a sound, a low, menacing whistle, followed by a dull thump. Marcus saw the arrow just as it buried itself deep in his horse's neck. The animal let out a terrible, piercing scream and reared back in agony, its eyes wide with panic. The sudden, violent movement threw both Marcus and Sarah from the saddle. They hit the hard, rocky ground with bone-jarring force. Sarah scrambled for cover behind a large boulder as a hail of bullets erupted from below, chewing up the stone around her. Indians! One of Jake's men screamed from the base of the cliff. Marcus peered over his own cover and saw them. On the opposite ridge, as if they had materialized out of the rock itself, were 6 Apache warriors. They were armed with rifles and bows, their faces grim, their intent clear. They had Jake's men pinned down, caught in a deadly crossfire between the cliff face and the ridge. But this wasn't some random raiding party. This was something else entirely. Marcus recognized the warrior in the lead, a tall, scarred man named Crow Feather. And Marcus knew, with a sudden, chilling certainty, that Crow Feather had every reason in the world to hate the railroad and everyone associated with it. 2 years ago, railroad security men had massacred an Apache village to clear the way for a new spur line, a massacre that Marcus's father had documented in horrifying detail right here in this journal. They're not here for us, Marcus yelled to Sarah over the gunfire. He pulled her from her exposed position, dragging her behind a more solid-looking rock formation. They're here for them. How do you know? Because a month ago, I found Crow Feather, Marcus explained, reloading his own pistol. I gave him the names from my father's journal, the names of the men who ordered the attack on his village. He's been hunting the same people we have. The battle below was pure, bloody chaos. Jake's men were trapped, getting cut to pieces. 3 of them went down in the first volley from the Apache. But Jake Morrison was no fool. He wasn't going to get pinned down and slaughtered. He saw his opening. Instead of trying to fight the Apache, he and his 2 best shooters started climbing, coming straight for Marcus and Sarah's position. He was still after the journal. "He's coming," Sarah said, her voice tense as she leveled her pistol at the ledge below. "Let him," Marcus said, his voice grim. A moment later, Jake's head appeared over the rocks. He was panting, his face streaked with sweat and grime. He raised his pistol, but Marcus was already waiting for him. "Hello, Jake." "Give me the journal, Dalton," Jake snarled. "This ends now." "Does it?" Marcus said, his voice cold. "Because before you do anything stupid, I think you should know something about your brother, James." Jake's face twisted into a mask of pure rage. "Don't you dare speak his name. You and your father's crusade got him killed." "No," Marcus shot back. "Your brother was trying to help my father. He was feeding him information from the inside. The men who killed my father are the same men who killed him, and they're the same men who are paying you to hunt me down right now." "You're a liar," Jake roared. Marcus held up the journal, flipping it open to a specific page. "Read it yourself, Jake." He tossed the book across the narrow gap between them. Jake snatched it out of the air. His eyes, full of hate, dropped to the page. He saw it, his brother's name, written in William Dalton's careful hand. Details of their secret meetings, a plan to expose the corruption together, and the final damning entry: James Morrison, railroad investigator, murdered. 3 days after our last meeting, Jake's gun hand wavered. The fury on his face was replaced by a look of dawning horror and confusion. "They played us, Jake," Marcus said, pressing his advantage. "They turned us against each other. They told you I was responsible for your brother's death, and they sent you to clean up their last loose end. Me." The Apache war cries were getting closer. The battle below was almost over. Jake's few remaining men were breaking, running for their lives. "There's more," Sarah called out. She'd been looking over Jake's shoulder, reading from the journal. "The man who gave the orders for both murders. My father wrote his name down. He's the sheriff of Dust Creek, Sheriff Crawford." She looked at Jake. "He's probably the one who told you where to find Marcus today." Jake's face went slack. The pieces were all falling into place, forming a picture of betrayal so vast it was almost incomprehensible. Sheriff Crawford, the man who'd hired him, the man who'd fed him information. "Crawford has been using you," Marcus said, "using your grief to make you do his dirty work. And once you brought him this journal, he would have put a bullet in your back too. No loose ends." An Apache arrow whistled past Jake's ear, a stark reminder that they were all still in mortal danger. "The corruption goes deeper," Sarah said, her eyes still scanning the journal. "My God, they're planning to frame the Apache for a series of raids along the new line, justify a military response to seize their land for the railroad expansion." Jake looked down at the journal in his hands, then up at Marcus. The hate in his eyes was gone, replaced by a cold, burning fury aimed at an entirely new target. "If this is true," Jake began, "then we need to get back to Dust Creek," Marcus finished. "We need to get back there alive, before Sheriff Crawford realizes his whole plan is falling apart and disappears for good." But as the 3 of them looked down from the ledge toward the distant town, they saw a plume of dust rising from the trail. A group of riders breaking away from the battle. They were racing back toward Dust Creek, Crawford's men. They knew, and they were going back to erase the evidence. The alliance was born of desperation and a shared enemy. Marcus, Sarah, and the man who'd been hunting them just minutes before, Jake Morrison, rode hard for Dust Creek. But they knew they were too late. By the time they reached the hills overlooking the town, the sun was a bloody smear on the horizon, and pillars of black smoke were clawing at the sky. It wasn't the smoke of hearth fires. Buildings were burning. "Crawford's brought in hired guns," Jake said, his voice a low growl. He was looking through Marcus's spyglass. "At least 20 of them. They're not locals." "He's destroying the evidence," Sarah realized, her voice filled with horror. "Look, the bank, the land office. They're burning any place that would keep official records." Marcus watched as years of his father's painstaking work, The proof he'd died to gather turned to ash and smoke. Every ledger, every deed, every signed document was being systematically erased from existence. It made him feel sick to his stomach. There, Sarah said, pointing. A group of armed men were dragging someone out of the town's small hotel. Through the spyglass, Marcus recognized him. It was the auctioneer. They were forcing him into the sheriff's office, which had become a makeshift fortress. They're rounding up witnesses, Jake said grimly. Anyone who was at the auction this morning. Anyone who saw you spend that money. Anyone who heard my men say your name. Then they saw it. A body lying in the middle of the main street, a dark pool spreading out from beneath it. The bearded man, the one who had been bidding on Sarah. He was a loose end, and he'd been tied off. This is my fault, Marcus said, the words tasting like poison. I walked right into his trap. I should have kept riding. No, Sarah said, her voice firm, her hand finding his arm. This started years ago. Your father knew a day like this was coming. That's why he left you the journal. He knew the truth would have to be forced into the light. She was right, but it didn't make the sight of the burning town any easier to bear. A shadow fell over them. They all turned, hands flying to their guns. It was Crow Feather. He had appeared beside them as silently as the setting sun. His face was streaked with fresh war paint, but his eyes were ancient and filled with a grim understanding. The corrupt ones burn the truth, the Apache warrior said, his English careful and precise. But fire cannot burn what lives in memory. What are you saying? Marcus asked. Your father made a promise to my people, that the world would know what happened to our children. The men who ordered the massacre of my village. They are in that town. He looked toward the chaos below. Crawford gives the orders, but the man who pays him, he comes tonight. A new chill, colder than the approaching night, ran down Marcus's spine. Who? Who pays him? The one you call Morrison. Jake went completely still. He stared at Crow Feather, his face a mask of confusion. That's impossible. Morrison is my family name. Not your brother, Crow Feather said, his dark eyes locking onto Jake. The older one, the one who owns the railroad. Sarah gasped. She snatched the journal from Jake, her hands frantically flipping through the pages until she found what she was looking for. Here, she said, her voice shaking. An entry from 6 months before his death. Your father met with him, Theodore Morrison, railroad executive. Jake's face went white. He looked like he'd been gut-punched. Uncle Theodore, he whispered, the name sounding like a curse on his lips. He's the one who told me Marcus was a traitor. He's the one who told me Marcus got James killed. He's the one who's been paying me all this time. He sent you to kill the one man who could expose the truth, Sarah said, the terrible logic falling into place. The truth about a murder that he ordered. As if on cue, a new sound reached them from the road leading into town. The sound of more horses and the rattle of a carriage. A fine, expensive carriage, escorted by another half-dozen heavily armed outriders. Theodore Morrison, Jake breathed, and in that single whisper, Marcus could hear a lifetime of trust and loyalty shattering like glass. He's coming to watch the fire, Marcus said, his voice hard as iron, to make sure the job is done right, to see the journal burned and all of us dead. Then let's not disappoint him, Sarah said, checking the ammunition in her pistol again, her fear replaced by a cold, hard anger. But as they prepared to move, Crow Feather held up a hand, stopping them. The Apache have a saying, he said. The snake is most dangerous when it believes it is cornered. He was right. Theodore Morrison was the snake, and he wouldn't have come here unless he was absolutely certain his victory was at hand. Whatever trap Crawford had set in that town, it was designed to be lethal and inescapable. Wait, Sarah said suddenly, her eyes glued to the last few pages of the journal. There's something else. Your father, he was smarter than any of them. He hid a second copy of everything. Insurance, he called it. Where? Marcus demanded, hope flaring in his chest for the first time in hours. Where is it? It's in Dusk Creek, she said, with someone Theodore Morrison would never, ever suspect. They all looked down at the burning town, at the armed men patrolling the streets, at the chaos and the death. Somewhere in that inferno was the key, the one thing that could still bring them all down. Who? Jake asked, his voice raw. Who has the second copy? Sarah looked up from the journal, her face illuminated by the distant flames. The priest. And as one, their eyes turned to the one building in the center of town that wasn't on fire. The church. Its stone bell tower rose above the smoke, untouched. It wasn't just being spared, it was being guarded. The church was a stone island in a sea of fire. Theodore Morrison's hired guns patrolled its perimeter, their rifles glinting in the hellish light of the burning buildings. They were protecting it, waiting for the priest to hand over the evidence they knew he had. But Marcus knew a secret. Years ago, as a boy traveling with his father, he'd attended a service in this very church. And his father, a man who noticed everything, had pointed out the priest's private entrance, hidden behind a tangle of overgrown ivy in the garden at the back. "You're all insane," Jake whispered, as Marcus quickly laid out the plan. "Even if we get inside, Morrison has 20 men out there." 21, Sarah corrected, her eyes fixed on a new rider who had just joined the cordon. "But they're all watching the front door." Crow Feather studied the layout of the town, his mind working like a master tactician's. "My warriors will create a diversion," he said. "A loud one. Draw the wolves away from the den." Jake looked at the Apache warrior, still struggling with the shifting allegiances. "Why would you do this? Why help us?" Crowfeather's gaze was unwavering. "Because when the snake's head is cut off, my people will have justice for our murdered children. Your justice and mine are the same." As true darkness finally fell, cloaking the hills, Marcus felt the crushing weight of the last 3 years settle on his shoulders. Everything his father had lived for, everything he had died for, it all came down to this. One desperate, impossible gamble in a town gone mad. They moved like wraiths through the shadows at the edge of town. Crow Feather's warriors were the first to strike. They hit the hotel where Theodore Morrison himself was waiting, unleashing a volley of gunfire and terrifying war cries. Just as planned, the hired guns were thrown into confusion. More than half of them abandoned their posts at the church and raced toward the sound of the attack, eager to protect their paymaster. It was the opening they needed. Marcus, Sarah, and Jake slipped through the chaos, circled around to the back of the church, and found the hidden door in the priest's garden. It was unlocked. Inside, Father Miguel was waiting for them. He was an old man with eyes that had seen far too much sorrow, but they held a core of unbreakable resolve. "I have been expecting you for months, Marcus," he said, his voice calm amidst the storm outside. He led them into his small study and pulled a heavy wooden box from a hiding place beneath the stone altar. "Your father was a good man, and a very thorough one." Jake lifted the lid. Inside wasn't just a second copy of the journal. It was more. Detailed financial ledgers that his father had smuggled out, signed and notarized affidavits from witnesses Marcus had thought were long dead, and a series of small black and white photographs, pictures of mass graves, pictures of Theodore Morrison meeting with known assassins. "This," Jake breathed, his voice thick with awe and disgust, "is enough to hang half the territorial government." "More than enough," Father Miguel agreed. "But it is useless if it does not leave this room. Mr. Morrison is a patient man. He knows you are here. He is simply waiting for you to try and run." That's when Sarah, who had been digging deeper into the box, pulled out one last item. It was a map, a detailed architectural drawing of the Dust Creek Bank, the very same bank that was currently a raging inferno. And on the map, a secret sub-basement was clearly marked. "He's been hiding it here the whole time," she whispered. "Millions of dollars. The physical cash. The proof of every theft, every bribe, every murder." A loud crash from the front of the church made them all jump. The sound of splintering wood. The diversion was over. Morrison's men had realized the ruse and were coming for them. "Father, is there another way out?" Marcus asked urgently. "Only the bell tower," the priest said, his face grim. "But it is a long drop to the ground below." Heavy boots were thundering on the stone floor of the nave. Shouts echoed through the sanctuary. They were trapped, boxed in, again. And in that moment, with the end seemingly inevitable, Marcus made a choice. It was a choice that surprised Jake, surprised Sarah, and even surprised himself. He handed the box of evidence to Jake. "Take this," he said, his voice steady. "Take Sarah. Use the bell tower. Get this to the territorial capital. no matter what. What about you? Sarah cried, grabbing his arm. I'm done running, Marcus said. He turned and walked out of the priest's study, through the sanctuary, and straight toward the splintered front doors of the church. He walked out into the square, into the ring of waiting guns, his hands empty and held high. Theodore Morrison stood there, a cruel, triumphant smile on his face. He had won. His problem was about to be permanently solved. Well, well, Marcus Dalton, the old man sneered. Come to meet your end with dignity? But then another figure emerged from the church doors behind Marcus. It was Jake, and he wasn't running. He was holding the open box of evidence high for everyone to see. Hello, Uncle, Jake called out, his voice ringing with betrayal and cold fury. Surprised to see me alive? Theodore Morrison's smile vanished. His face cycled through shock, confusion, and finally settled on a look of pure reptilian hatred. Jacob, they told me you were dead. Just like you told me Marcus Dalton killed my brother, Jake shot back. The old man's silence was a confession, and it wasn't a bullet that brought Theodore Morrison's empire of lies down. It was the words. The townspeople, drawn out by the chaos, had started to gather at the edges of the square. And they listened, their faces illuminated by the dying fires, as Jake Morrison stood in front of the church and read from William Dalton's journal. He read about the stolen wages. He read about the murdered witnesses, men they had known, their friends and neighbors. He read about the massacre of the Apache. And last, he read his own brother's final, secret entry detailing his uncle's treason. The truth, once spoken, could not be burned. It could not be buried. It spread through that crowd like wildfire. Morrison's hired guns looked at each other, then at the angry faces of the townspeople surrounding them. Their money wasn't worth dying for. One by one, they lowered their rifles. The railroad money, recovered from the secret vault, was returned. The Apache lands were protected, and the names of their dead were finally entered into the record. Sheriff Crawford and the rest of Morrison's conspirators were brought to justice by the very laws they had twisted for their own gain. And Sarah never had to worry about being sold again. Marcus Dalton had kept his promise to his father. The truth was out. As for the quiet drifter who had ridden into town looking for nothing but peace, he used his share of the reward money to buy a small ranch just outside of town, a place where a woman with fiery, defiant eyes helped him raise horses and build a life that was finally worth the terrible price his father had paid for it. If you enjoyed this story and you want to hear more tales of buried secrets and justice hard won, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button and ring that notification bell. You won't want to miss what's coming next.